compromising on ethics. He is currently the publisher at McKinsey Global Publishing. He began his business journalism career at the Economic Times in New Delhi and his US journalism career at the Dayton Daily News. He then went on to work for iconic newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. He led the Wall Street Journal to record digital audiences and played a vital role in establishing a data-informed decision-making culture around digital publishing. At the Washington Post, he was primarily responsible for integrating its then separate print and online newsroom and businesses. He's also the founder of Mint, one of India's largest business newspapers. He has also served as News Corp's Senior Vice President of Strategy and the Chief Executive of Gizmodo Media Group. He's a board trustee of the Wikimedia Foundation, which operates Wikipedia. He's also on the National Advisory Council of the Democracy Fund, a resource to strengthen the democratic process in America. In many ways, his life seems to be a quest to answer the question, when is the last time I did something for the first time? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Raju Narisetti.
Thank you, Tanya. That was very generous. And all of you who have listened to that can realize that the value of inflation is still very much holding up. Thank you. Appreciate that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here. It's been a while since I talked to student journalists. I did that for full time at Columbia for the last few years, and I'm always happy to make the time. I do want to say, I typically tend to be on the record in these conversations, and because everything I have to say, I usually say in public. My current role is at McKinsey makes it a little bit more complicated because the firm has like very strong policies on generally not talking about specific companies or anybody, simply because for McKinsey, it's a global firm. It's been around for 94 years, and over 94 years, some of these companies may have been clients or could be future clients. So they avoid talking about specific companies. So I just want to give you that caveat, and also want to say that everything I'm saying is a deeply personal opinion. It has nothing to do with McKinsey. And if any of you want to feel so compelled to tweet or say something about it, I would appreciate if you don't tag McKinsey, because they have nothing to do with what I'm saying right now. So just appreciate that. With that, I'm happy to answer any and all questions. I didn't have I wanted it to be more conversational, so I didn't have like a presentation, or I didn't want to come and speak for 20 minutes and then pontificate about things, because I wanted it to be about what topics are of interest to you and what's on your mind these days. Also, another caveat, I haven't been a practicing journalist for a while, so most of my prism in recent years is around how do we do sensible things to preserve good journalism, and how do we support that financially. I keep an eye on all things India just because I'm interested. Lots of friends, obviously, in journalism. A lot of the Mint newsroom is still very much people I've hired. So in that sense, I do keep up with India, but I may not have very specific granular details. If you ask me about Republic TV, I would generally not have an answer, because I didn't watch Indian TV when I was in India because it gave me unnecessary palpitations. Now I don't watch it at all. So there are some things I may tell you, look, I don't have enough knowledge to answer properly. So with that caveat, over to you.
Thank you, Raju. In a speech last year, you had said that all predictions about the imminent death of journalism and media houses were fake news. Now with COVID and the severe impact it has had on the field, thousands of journalists in India and abroad have lost jobs. Do you still hold that view?
Yeah, so I make a very clear distinction between journalism and news organizations.
Okay.
So I think when people refer to the death of journalism, they're talking about a group of organizations or a specific organization that may not survive because of the things you talked about, because of the business models being challenging, because of competition, because of falling revenue. And we've seen that, right? And papers and websites even have come and gone, have merged, have disappeared. The point I try to make is that journalism, which is the act of like reporting on events, that will always be very, very vibrant. It has been since, I don't know, 1450, right? When we invented the Gutenberg press and started printing things.
Yes.
And the way to think about it is, if you really step back and have a very macro view, and this is very important for journalism students, right? Because when they look at what's happening with job cuts, especially in the US, things folding, they might think that, there's no future. But the way I would like them to think about it is this way, which is, let's assume that everything is going to be digital, which I think is a fairly good assumption. Even with that assumption, it was only like about a year ago that 50% of the world's population was able to get on the internet every day. Right? It was like November of 2018, I think, that we crossed 50% of the world's population being able to get on the internet. And since then, it's probably 55%, right? What does that mean? It means that there are 3 billion more people, give or take, who are going to come on the internet in the next, let's say, 10 years, because the speed at which internet is spreading is pretty rapid. And 3 billion new people, and some of them will only watch YouTube, some of them will only be on WhatsApp, but a significant group of them will also look for content, look for news, look for information. And so, first of all, the supply of consumers is going to be dramatically more in the next decade, right? Two, if you look at what's happening, who are the providers of information, we tend to think of YouTube, Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok, you name it, right? But when you really step back, they're all amazing platforms for sharing information, for virality, but the majority of them don't actually create any content. So if you actually want to read about something, it has to be created by some news organization somewhere and then shared. So the need for what we do as journalists has never been more in the history of journalism. 500 years, if you just start with the printing press. So if you look at yourself that way, if you look at yourself as amazing storytellers who can use multimedia, you can provide information in a compelling, engaging way, then we all, not me, I'm in my 50s, but all of the young people getting into journalism today have a very bright future as journalists. What it means, though, is that the days of joining Times of India or the Economic Times or even Business Line and spending the next 20 years there, I think that probably won't be true. So you should be prepared, first of all, to be able to tell good stories using multimedia. You should also be very prepared to have 5, 6, 7 different roles over your next 10, 15 years. So if you are willing to embrace that kind of uncertainty, and my view is that most people get into journalism because they love deadlines, they love the fact that things change almost every day. So they are used to some uncertainty. If you can apply that to your own life, you will probably have a very bright future.
Okay. Speaking of roles, you have played 5 different roles in the past 10 years, that of a journalist, editor, corporate executive in charge of strategy, CEO, university prof, and even publisher now. They all probably need different skill sets. How did you develop them? Did you make a conscious effort? And in this context, what would be your advice to the students here who are starting their careers in the field?
Right. I mean, clearly I couldn't keep a job, the number of jobs I've moved. No, but look, a few things. A lot of people, and I'm used to this question a little bit because, especially in the US, there are a growing number of Indians or Asians in journalism, but still not a lot. So I get a lot of, especially Indian journalism students in New York and other places often reach out and ask about a career trajectory. And the reality is that most of it was not planned, right? So I grew up in Hyderabad, did my BA in economics from Nizam College. I was terrible at math and science, so never could do any of that. And then I went to IRMA, Institute of Rural Management in Anand, for 2 years, where I got my business degree. And I was always interested in business. And wanting to do business journalism. Those were my 2 interests, if you will. Over time, they gravitated towards kind of thinking that there are a lot of good journalists, and I'm sure like everybody your class are probably better journalists than I was at that age, because they can tell stories with multimedia, and I couldn't tell. I used to type my stories on a typewriter. I'm that old. So there are lots of good journalists coming. So the problem for the journalism business is not a pipeline of good journalists. The problem with the journalism business is not enough people who appreciate journalism, appreciate that as a product and a value, and can apply some business skills. So about 10, 12 years ago, when opportunities came, I raised my hand and started slowly moving towards doing more and more business things and being at the intersection of journalism and product and technology and strategy. And the last 6 or 7 years, I completely moved over to the dark side, if you will, and haven't committed any acts of journalism. So what are the skills you need, right? The primary skill, I think any successful person in the news business, whether it's on the news side or on the business side, needs is curiosity, because you absolutely have to be curious about, you see something and you wonder why, right? That curiosity then translates into saying, let me do some reporting, find out why it is the way it is. You should have some hypothesis, but you shouldn't let your hypothesis be the story. You should let your reporting be the story. And then prove your hypothesis could be right or wrong, but you should have that essential curiosity. So that's the fundamental successful skill. If you're not curious about things, if you're not always asking questions about the why, what does it mean, why is it that way, then you probably won't be a good journalist. Then it'll just be a job for you. The second skill you need to have, which I think your class, ACJ, is particularly good at, and others in journalism schools are trying to be good at, is the ability to take that curiosity, apply it to an engaging way to tell that story, right? Because if you can't tell that story in an engaging way, then you don't have a big audience who will then understand the effects of your curiosity. So I think fundamentally, curiosity, having the multimedia skills, if you go out into the world today saying, I want to be a radio reporter, right? You might still have a decent career, but your career probably is very limited. But if you tell yourself that I'm good at storytelling, my audiences might want to consume me in reading me, looking at me, by that I mean pictures, watching me, by that I mean video, listening to me, by that I mean audio, whether it's radio or podcasts, interacting with me, by which I mean thinking of your journalism as interactive databases where somebody can type in something and look up information. So if you think of it that way and have those skills, I think that's the perfect combination. The other skill may be, I think, valuable in India as well, for sure, right? But less so because you can get by with English and maybe Hindi most of India. But if you're in the Western world, having a language that is beyond English and perhaps not a Western language. So Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, right? These are the kind of languages. If you have that, and then you become even more relevant and important for a news organization. And finally, like I said, you need to be not too worried about like the fact that you may change jobs many times. So having that ability to kind of say, I'm okay with some level of uncertainty about my own future, I think then all that combination, I think, is the perfect combination to succeed.
Venki, you had a question, right? Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Raju. We thought we might call upon your vantage position as somebody who has a bird's eye view of the media landscape in the US to draw some, to call upon some of your observations insofar as they relate to the tussle going on between news and opinion page. And just by way of background for the students who are not knowing.
Can you guys keep the mics on mute, please? Those who are not. Yeah.
So
can you repeat that sentence?
I'll do that. I'll do that. Raju, I just thought we might draw upon your understanding of a close view of the media landscape in the US, particularly insofar as there's been a sort of a reputational damage or the perception that some newspapers of repute have lost a bit of their reputation in the ongoing tussle between the newsroom as well as the opinion page. I'll just, purely by way of backgrounder for the students, I bear with me for a couple of minutes. This is just to say that, the New York Times published an op-ed by a senator, Republican senator, making a provocative case for Trump administration to send in the troops to put down the Black Lives Matter protests. And to which the newsroom at the New York Times, some of the reporters said, they gave voice to their disquiet in an open letter to the editors and the owners, proprietors, and subsequently the opinion page editor had to step down, sort of as it was perceived that the Chinese wall, as they say, between the newsroom and the opinion section had been breached. And curiously, much the same thing happened in Wall Street Journal, your old place of publication, place of employment. And the Wall Street Journal responded in a very different fashion when they, what's called the woke rebellion, as it's called, when it sort of gained momentum in the Wall Street Journal newsroom. Wall Street Journal's proprietors, responded in a diametrically opposite fashion. They said they carried a letter to the readers in which they said the Wall Street Journal is not the New York Times, effectively saying that we will not allow newsroom to encroach on the opinion section space. So how do you see this tug of war playing out, Raju? I mean, are you conflicted at all in terms of who's in the right and who's in the wrong here? Is it permissible for a newsroom to approach editorial spaces? Is that the new normal?
Thank you. There are several parts to this question. Let me just talk about some more structural changes that impact this, and then talk about the specific cases here as well a little bit. I think in the print world, as we know it, it was easy to confine opinions to a clearly labeled page or two, right? We still do that. You read a paper, you get to a point where it starts opinion, editorial page, or whatever you want to call them. In Mint, I call them views, very clearly saying this is a view, not news. So, and so it was very easy in that world, pre-internet, for people to come to a bundle of content and say, oh, okay, I know what this is, and this is different from this, right? At least that was our belief. We would label it, and we'll think that readers would understand that. As an industry, I don't think we've done a good job communicating that very well to readers, saying this is what this means, or this is what we try to make what this means. This is an opinion, this is a point of view, this is not necessarily a reported fact, even though we hope that the opinions wouldn't have false information in them. And then the rest of it is news. And the newsrooms were always separate, right? There was a newsroom that was reporting, and then there was an opinions page. And in the West, historically, these have reported to different people as well, very deliberately. They never, in India, I think it's different where they all report into one group sometimes, but these were very separate. So we kept it that way. And when the internet came, in the beginning, it was easy because in the beginning, we just took our print paper and put it on the website and had the same structure, right? We labeled something opinion, we labeled something, and we thought that, okay, people will still understand it. What we didn't anticipate was that social media and Twitter and all these platforms would come that would break open this bundle. Meaning that on Twitter, somebody could tweet a link and say, the New York Times is saying Trump is evil, right? And people would read it, people would click on it, they will go to a page, they're not going to pay attention to up or down. Sometimes they don't even read it, right? They just look at the tweet and respond to it. The distinction between opinion and news started getting really blurry. So people who are not familiar with it, and that was already a small group of us, right? People who were diehard news people who understood the difference. They immediately started saying, oh, the New York Times is a liberal left-wing rag. And then similarly, a lot of people will say the Wall Street Journal is a right-wing kind of, Reaganite paper, without making the distinction that we're talking about an opinion, an editorial, an unsigned editorial, or a news story. So I think as an industry, we have failed to keep that distinction alive on digital. We are really struggling even now. And so we've caused this problem. We have disintermediated that bundle. So as a result, people's reactions over time in the last 5-6 years have been to not make that distinction. To worldwide, right? This didn't begin with Trump. It's probably not going to end with Trump. Worldwide, lots of politicians are also using labels for an entire brand without making the distinction as well, right? They're saying X is fake news or Y is whatever, right? And that's playing into this as well. So all of this, I think, are causing a lot of questions about how do we deal with it. There are some people who say, maybe they should, like you should separate these two into two separate brands. I hear this argument quite a bit on internet about the Wall Street Journal, saying, why do they even bother? Why don't they have like a completely separate brand for their opinions? But the reality is the success of the Wall Street Journal historically has been dependent on people liking the bundle, right? So if you separate those, the business model gets even more challenged at a time when we don't want to challenge business models that are already challenged. So it's not a very viable solution to say, I will separate out opinions into a separate brand and I'll keep my new stuff in one brand very pure. So the solutions are also not very easy. And then to your question about like the church and state, this wasn't a breach of church and state in the sense that the newsroom was not writing about opinions. This was the newsroom expressed a view publicly saying that there are some issues with facts. And in some cases, when the facts are facts, the idea of that there's an other side of this, meaning there's an opinion that is different, it's fine, but it can't go against like some facts. I think this is where the other issue is playing out, which is as the industry moves away from advertising, particularly in the US, and increasingly is dependent on reader revenue, right? Individual readers, subscribers, and that's what is driving. Every reader now is feeling more and more empowered to speak up. In the old days, the few readers who spoke up, what did they do? They wrote a letter to the editor, right? The die-hard, serious, angry people. The editors had the choice of choosing 3 or 5 letters and throwing away all the other letters, right? You never knew who wrote what. You only saw what 5, 6, 7 letters that were published. Now, these readers, first of all, they're paying subscribers, so they're very demanding. 2, they have the means. They have Twitter. They have their own way to express their anger and their frustration. So this is also playing into it, where the business model has shifted to be dependent on individual subscribers. The subscribers have more power to express their views publicly and can create a very quick echo chamber, right? So I think all of these factors are impacting this. There is no easy solution from a business model point of view of separating these two and completely bifurcating it. So it's a struggle, and it's an ongoing challenge. In some cases, some decisions will be smart. In some cases, you could second guess the decisions. But this is just an evolving issue. In the UK, where newspapers have always had a point of view, right? The Guardian is seen as left or right of something. The Times of London is seen as conservative or liberal. There, the model has always been an integrated model, right? Some people could argue maybe that is the way to go, rather than pretending to have the newsroom be very middle of the road objective and the op-ed pages be right or left of something. Maybe we should stop pretending that. That's a solution for some people too, by the way, right? Some brand could decide that we no longer want to be, and it's happening in a few local newspapers owned by individuals. They're saying, this is my view and this will be the view throughout the paper. So that's also possible. So we are seeing a lot of different attempts and no real answers because the platforms have upended the traditional ways of dealing with this.
Sashad, can I get in another question, or do you want to throw it open to the students?
No, you can ask the questions. I'll remind the students that you can send in your questions to chat. And if any one of you want to ask, you can also raise the hand and we will come to you.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Venki, go ahead with your question.
Raju, I have a sort of a follow-up question to this. One of the things we teach our students in these journalism programs is to be scrupulously objective in the way they see the world. I mean, at least the way they communicate their understanding of the world, insofar as they're beat reporters, so to speak. Are you? But the advent of social media, particularly what do you call the Twitter and stuff like that. So what it has done is to it's perfectly okay for them to have views they're all active citizens, so they probably have views about the world. But as as people who are assigned a beat, so to speak, and who are reporters who are supposed to bring in a certain objectivity in their day jobs, are you at all disquieted by the fact that they sound off sometimes trenchantly on social media platforms? Do you favor a social media policy? Because Indian media entities have gone back and forth on this. Sometimes they drop social media guidelines for their reporters. Opinion writers can do whatever they want generally. But typically what happens is the reporters, they have a social media policy in place where they are not, they're not required to make known their make public their opinions on matters. Where do you stand on that, Raju? And what kind of best practices maybe deploy in Indian newsrooms, so to speak?
So my view is that anybody who agrees to take a job in a news organization and work for a brand has to agree to certain policies of the brand or of that news organization, right? This is not a freedom of speech. There's nothing. You take a job, you work for a company, you have to agree to whatever the company's policies are. You could internally debate about whether that's a good policy or not. So I have no compunctions about having policies that make sense. One. Two, I think the issue is that, and by the way, this is a minority opinion even in the US, because I have tended to have strong opinions on social media, but I only began expressing them publicly once I left journalism, meaning that if I'm not committing acts of journalism myself, that's when I decided, okay, I will now, up until then, in fact, I remember tweeting something in probably 2014, and an old colleague of mine from the journal said, in 20 years of working with you, I didn't know your politics. Now I know, but I was no longer in the newsroom, right? So I think I drew that personal distinction. This was like when there were not really a lot of policies. And I've also gotten into trouble occasionally at an organization by saying something and somebody from PR coming and telling me, are you sure that we should be saying that? And I'm like, I'm saying it as a person and it's not affecting my job. Right? And I did that when I worked for Rupert Murdoch, and they didn't, News Corp, for all its credit, didn't have an issue because I wasn't dealing with news issues. I was on the business side of it. I do think that we all live in societies. We all have views. We all need to be part of society. We can't isolate ourselves from it. Having said that, if you are in a job and you're getting a paycheck and somebody's paying for you to do a job, you have to be responsible for that brand and the integrity and the what damage you could personally do to that brand. So if you're a beat reporter, let's say you're covering railways, right? Your job is to be you should be on Twitter. You should be talking about news events. You should be kind of being quick because you want to help your brand. You want to help your story. You want to bring people to your story. So you should definitely be on Twitter, for example, if you're a railways reporter. And your job is to provide information. Your job is to provide context. Your job is not, you could say, for example, if that was the 5th derailment in monsoons in Mumbai, you could say that, right? You could say that this is the 5th derailment in Mumbai this month during monsoons. And every year we say we are going to improve it, and it hasn't improved, right? That's a very fact-based, it's an opinion, but it's a fact, it's context. What you should not be saying is the railway authority sucks, right? Because then it's your opinion, and I'm not questioning you should have that opinion on. But when you do that, the next time you do a story about railways, somebody is very much entitled to say, I don't trust this guy or this person because this person has already decided that the railway authority sucks, right? So why would I trust this person to be objective from now on, right? So you're damaging your own brand, you're damaging your story, you're damaging the ability to bring people to read your story because they no longer trust you. So I think that judgment has to be applied. And I think it's fine for news organizations to do it. But in India in particular, a lot of the problems in Indian newsrooms are not because of individual journalists. There are some problems because of individual journalists, but a lot of the problems coming out of a lot of journalism issues in India are not at the individual level. They're at the news organizations' inability to maintain standards, enforce standards, and be consistent level. I have found this that a lot of editors don't actually spend the energy on internal issues and maintaining standards, kind of talking to young people, saying, here's why we should do X or Y, or having policies, having training. So when you don't have that, and especially young journalists then do what they do, then you can't blame them, right? Because end of the day, somebody has to help them be better at what they are. So, and is this again, I mean, again, you'll see ever so often some news organization will say something and then 2 days later will say, well, we've thought about it. That wasn't the right response. So we are tweaking it. And that's fine, by the way, right? The point of journalism standards and rules inside a news organization is they should never be written in stone. They should always be flexible and be willing to ask questions saying, is this the right policy for the moment? There are some that are inviolable standards, right? The rest should be flexible enough. So yes, you should have a policy. B, you should not be doing anything that hurts the brand, that hurts your own credibility, that hurts your ability to bring people to read your content. But you should also be having a presence on social media.
Thank you for that. Malavika Makol, you had a question. Go ahead with it.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. My name is Malavika Makol, and I'm a student in the ACJ Bloomberg program. So my question to you is that there's a lot of rising discourse about how journalism should be not-for-profit in order to, uphold the central idea of truth to power. Do you believe that such a business model is sustainable?
Yeah. So again, a personal view. I've always been a capitalist at heart, and I've always believed that if you're going to create a sustainable model, it needs to pay for itself, right? Non-profit is a model, by the way. It's one of many models and can be successful. ProPublica is an amazing example of doing amazing journalism, right? And completely non-profit. But ProPublica has like really, really smart fundraising capacity. They have built that capacity, right? But that's a skill they have really acquired, hired the right people, invested in it, and very few people have been able to replicate that. So you should approach nonprofit as a model, and then you have to recognize that requires certain skills, and if you have those, more power to you, right? Because if you look at museums, operas, all these things historically in the US, for example, they've all been funded by non-profit, right? And have survived for 200-300 years. So absolutely possible, and more power to people who can pull it off. The argument that you have to be non-profit and that's the only way you can do good journalism is actually fake, right? Because historically we've shown.
Can I request you to mute your audios, please? Yeah, sorry.
So historically we've shown you can do good journalism, you can do advocacy journalism, you can do even today, right? A lot of the stories you read about corruption, about deals, about like people doing bad things are being done by mainstream media, and a lot of it is for profit. So I'm not necessarily of the opinion that the only way you can do advocacy journalism or the only way you can do kind of journalism that holds people to account has to be nonprofit. It can be done for profit. Each has its own challenges. And look, I'm on the board of Wikipedia. We support Wikipedia. It's a completely advertising-free model. In fact, in India, we are running a campaign asking for your donations right now. But it means that every year we have to raise a lot of money to keep it going. That's a skill we have built and we have developed because we chose that path that there will be no advertising ever on Wikipedia. But that's a very conscious decision, but that requires a lot of skills and energy, by the way. We spend a lot of time fundraising, right? Because you have to do that if you want that model. So it's fine, totally fine to do it. And if there's a willingness. In a country like India, in the West, it's been possible because rich people have made their money, let's say, whatever way they made their money. The role of government in rich people's lives in India, in the West, is somewhat limited, especially in the US. So if Jeff Bezos wants to buy the Washington Post and wants to support it out of his own philanthropy, even though he has a big business, he's not as impacted by any government decision that is upset about him about the Washington Post. In countries like India, where the intersection of business and government and regulation is a lot tighter, you have to be sure that there are rich people wanting to give you the money, by the way. Because in India, potentially, they could get a lot of pressure from the government for supporting a nonprofit media organization that's writing tough stories. So your sources of funds may dry up a lot faster. So it depends on the country, depends on the political environment, and more than anything else, it depends on the capacity of a news organization to raise that money.
Ananya, you had a question. Ananya Dash, and could you unmute and ask that question, please?
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir.
Hi.
Sir, I'm Ananya Dash from the broadcast stream. So my question to you is, how would you compare the freedom of press in India with that of the United States?
Very different. And not because of, by the way, not because of government actions or any of that. In the US, you must understand that the constitutional right to free speech, the First Amendment, automatically gives a lot of protection. So you don't have to have other laws beyond that. And the Constitution in the US, despite some pressure, is still held up as a very sacred thing. And so as a result, most of the judicial system has really been on the side of freedom of expression as a result and because of media. In a lot of other countries, you don't have that fundamental building block, even though you may have the laws that on paper say that media rights are protected. So how every country then does this can be very different based on the judiciary interpreting it, the government in power, all of that, right? I think, so the fundamental difference is that that building block doesn't exist in India in a way that protects freedom of press. And it's an ebb and flow. In the emergency, obviously, there was a very open taking away of all freedoms, right? Which actually is not a bad thing because everybody knows that it's a transparent taking away. The problem becomes when it's a non-transparent taking away of press freedom by other forces, right? For example, in countries, including in India, where government is a major advertiser, right? You don't need to do anything other than put the pressure through that, right? It's a very overt and covert pressure, but you're not touching the laws. You're not like changing anything, but you're putting a lot of pressure on media. So there are ways that a government could act that can really suppress press freedoms without changing the laws, without making it look like anything has changed. So we have to be very careful about like first looking at laws and making that distinction, saying some countries have better laws than the others. 2, looking at the independence of the judiciary. 3, how is it actually happening in reality, right? On paper, you could have the press council, you could have the editors guild, but in reality, are they powerful? Are they actually doing anything? How vested are those interests? So then you have to make a determination. And I know that the annual Reporters Committee and some of the other press freedom indices that rank countries are somewhat controversial and not necessarily fully captured. But the advantage of having those relatively objective metrics is it shows over time whether you're slipping or whether you're gaining, right? The US has considerably slipped, by the way, in the last few years under the current administration. And that's a valid point, even though we have all these protections. So that to me is a good way to, and you can't look at it in 1 year, or you can't look at 10 cases in Kashmir or somewhere else and say, oh my God, world is ending. That's an illustration of what might be a larger trend. And the best way to do it is to look over multiple years. And then you have to also say, look, if in a democracy, people are electing a government and that government is doing certain things, you have to ask yourself, maybe that's what the people want, right? Because the people have elected that government. So there are interesting questions to ask rather than automatically jump to conclusions about somebody is evil and somebody is great for press freedoms. And there are times when press freedoms are not being taken, but they're being given up. Meaning that a lot of media organizations very voluntarily decide not to do something because they want to be on the right side of something, of a government or of a politician, right? So then we can't blame the government or the laws if a promoter or if a media company deliberately decides to actually not practice good journalism. And that, I think, happens quite a bit more in India. It can happen in the US and does happen in some cases. But overall, I would say that the ability for journalists to say and write and report on what they want to do is significantly protected in the US and a lot less so in action in India. On paper, they might feel the same.
Jay, you had a question. Go ahead with it.
Good evening, sir. My name is Jaiveer Shekhawat. I'm from Bloomberg Financial Program. So my question is, the media landscape has been changing a lot from the past few years. Also, the innovation has been taking place. But because of this corona pandemic, do you think this landscape and this innovation has taken a step back, or has it taken a leap forward in terms of business model, in terms of workplace?
Yeah, so it's definitely affected things that were not doing well, right? In the US, for example, it has affected local media that was already struggling. So some things that were on the bubble have like shut down maybe a little faster. It has significantly affected digital models because if you're dependent on advertising, the first thing that a company does when there's uncertainty about business is to pull back on discretionary spending, and advertising is a discretionary spending. So your visibility into what might happen in the rest of this year is very poor, by the way. You don't know because the companies don't know, and they don't want to spend money on something. They don't know what demand is going to be for cars, for example, or they don't know what demand is going to be for airlines. So if I'm an airline company, the first thing I'm doing is stopping all advertising because I have no idea when people are wanting to fly again. And if you're a website or if you're a news organization or a travel site, you're really hit pretty badly, right? So clearly, if you're very dependent on advertising, you're taking the biggest hits right now. I like to look, my view of the world has always been that the glass is not half empty or half full. The glass is always refillable. Right? That's my philosophy to life. So the way I look at it now is to say, sure, some people are really struggling and going out of business. Some people are actually doing okay. But the way I look at it is like people starting new things. And by the way, new media things are starting all the time, including in the US, and I think including in India. Newsletters, TikTok, or various ways people are starting to do things. The way I look at it is that if you're starting something this year, you're factoring in these challenges. And then you're already kind of figuring out what should be a model then when I already know that my COVID is impacting all of this stuff, right? So there are lessons that people are applying. So in a way that's good. But overall at a macro level, will we see a lot more journalism jobs be cut the rest of this year, particularly in the US? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, because we are not seeing any bounce back in the traditional revenues. And those who have subscriber revenue are doing okay because subscriptions tend to be something you don't immediately cut unless you have too many subscriptions. You usually tend to kind of, if you subscribe to a paper or like a few websites, chances are that you will not do that unless you are in real trouble, meaning unless you've absolutely lost your job or something like that. So those folks who are reliant on subscriptions will be okay. Those who are reliant heavily on advertising will be in more trouble. So you will see, unfortunately, a lot more job cuts, news of like more cuts coming in the US for sure. India, also in a similar situation, right? The bet is that somehow things will come back and print will go back to having good advertising. Chances are in the beginning that will be the case because print remains a very cost-effective way to reach millions of Indians. So advertisers will come back because they'll want to sell more things. But will the shift mean that some subscribers, some readers, some advertising money will permanently disappear from print in India, that is my bet. And I think anywhere from 20 to 40% of it is never going to come back. So if you're a news organization that's heavily dependent on print and 20 to 40% of that is not coming back, what do you do, right? You have to adjust your revenues to your costs. And the biggest cost center for most media companies tends to be often the newsroom. So yeah, I think there will be, unfortunately, more reductions. But again, remember, 3 billion people are going to come on the internet. So there are people starting in cool things on the web, and they may be small, they may not be as impactful, but there will be opportunities for those people as well. And at some point, investors, right? Investors are currently staying away from all media companies. We'll want to come back if somebody has a smarter, better model next year. They'll say, oh, this is worth investing in. So you'll see that come back as well, is my hope.
Dave, our new media faculty, Dave had a question. Can you go ahead and ask it, Dave?
Yeah. Hi, Raju. I'm Dave. My question is, do you think we should be working with the platforms, social media platforms, or fighting them? Is it going to be us versus them or us with them? And to continue that question, to add on to that question, do you think it was our failure, our total failure, when we had the audience, we had the viewers, we had the listeners, we failed to build the community? And what's the point in blaming the social media platforms when we failed? We never cared about the audience.
Yeah, so the answer to your first question is yes, meaning we should work with them and we should fight them where appropriate, right? So, and you're seeing that happen, right? We just did, I can tweet out that link, but it's available on my Twitter as well. We just did a fairly long interview with the CEO of the New York Times, Mark Thompson, who's just finishing a spectacular 8-year run with that company. And we just did a very long interview where he actually talks about it. In the beginning, like 7 years ago, the New York Times was the first partner for anything Facebook or Twitter or anybody would do. They would turn to them and they would jump in, they would do it with them together, they would embrace it as innovation. And there was a reason they did that, which is that they want to try out. Over time, they have figured out what platforms are friends and are helpful to your business model, and what platforms may be doing things that are not helpful to your business model. So once the New York Times decided that subscriptions, paid subscriptions is our business model, and they only did that, like, let's say 5 years ago, then they very deliberately chose partnerships with big platforms that will help that, and walked away from platforms or partnerships that didn't help that. So they went into Apple News, looked at it and said, you know what, in Apple News, we are being jumbled up with everything else. So we don't want that. We want people to look at the New York Times as a unique thing. So we want to walk out of that. They like Google News because Google News tends to bring people to you, right, in a clearly labeled way. They have done some things with Facebook and they've not done some things with Facebook. I think that's how you should look at it. Listen, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube, their business model is not to help your business model, right? So why should they? That's not what they are there for, right? So the onus is on us to say they're there for themselves. How do I leverage them? The way I always thought about Facebook, and I've been like long time at News Corp or everywhere else, I've steadfastly not wanted to do things with Facebook precisely because I was always at subscription-led companies, and I believe that our own destiny was in our own hands. The way I thought of Facebook was, wow, 2 billion people come to it every month, right? That's a big top of the funnel. And if I'm present there, if I can pull some of those people back to me, that's free advertising for me, right? I'm not spending money to get 2 billion people or a share of that. That's how I always looked at Facebook. So you should always be participating at that level. And then you should think very hard about your business model and say, if I want to do something else with them, does it make sense? For years, when I was running newsrooms, we were partners with YouTube to do some interesting projects, set up channels and stuff, because YouTube was willing to fund it. We learned a lot. We learned how to do video. And after the partnership ended, those skills remained with us. right? I built up teams, so I think that's the way you should play the game as well. And this shouldn't be a jihadist view of they're evil or they're not evil, right? We should be smart about leveraging what they can bring to us and walking away when our business model is in conflict with their business model.
Thank you. Raghav Gautam, you had a question. Go ahead and ask it.
Yeah, so hello, good day, everybody. My question is fairly simple. It is to do with this is something that has been plaguing me personally for quite a while. And as a student of journalism, I think this is the right moment to ask this question as well. What, sir, in your opinion, is given that we have a multitude of media outlets available at our disposal, what, in your opinion, is the best way for any person to consume unbiased content? Because we have outlets in the form of social media and new media, in addition to the pre-existing broadcast and print streams. How does an average person consume the right content? That is the question, sir.
Nice.
Raghav, anytime somebody says it's a simple question, I know a very complicated question is coming my way. I also should have set this up front, guys. So don't call me sir. I'm 54 and you're making me sound a lot older than I am, at least in my head. So Raju is fine. So listen, I think there's one assumption here that we are making, right? Which is that the average person, right? There isn't anybody like an average person, that they want to read unbiased news, right? That's an assumption that journalists often make. We think that because we tend to think of ourselves as unbiased, that we want everybody to be unbiased. But there is nothing wrong if, and I'm just, don't quote me on this because I don't want to get into the politics of, there's nothing wrong with a fan of Mr. Modi or Mr. Rahul Gandhi saying, I want to read a point of view that supports my point of view, right? So they may choose a particular brand because of that. So nothing wrong with that. So we shouldn't be forcing people to say that you have to be unbiased. Where we should focus on is two things. I would say the best way to be unbiased is to read the biased stuff and read a lot more variety of it, right? So I tend to kind of sample a range of things that I do not agree with, simply because it forces me to think of that point of view. I mean, totally going in, I may disagree, coming out, I may disagree, right? But it's forcing me to think about it. So the best way to do it is to kind of get people to consume a lot more things. And then the challenge becomes, how do you become that one thing that they should also read, right? So this is where I worry a little bit about news organizations that carry their strident anti-government or anti-authority or very liberal views on their label. So if I am a liberal urban brand, like let's say Scroll India, right? I know that the liberal elite or maybe liberal English language urban elite will read me, right? And sure, I can survive with that. But my job as leaders of that organization should be to say, how do I get the other people to read me? They may disagree with me, but let me at least engage them, right? That should be. So when you're stridently labeled, I'm an amazing editor. So I'm just picking an example because I couldn't think of an example that would relate to what I'm saying. So I'm not talking about Scroll per se, but I'm just giving you an illustration. But so if you're going to be having that point of view, fine. But your job should be to convince people who don't have that point of view to read it, right? So maybe you tone down your strident liberalness and say, here is how I can engage those people. I'm still liberal. I still have a point of view, right? So how do we become that? I think is a more interesting question for me. And that's why when people have strong opinions, I tend to walk away from them because my view is you already made up your mind. So what is the point in kind of having a conversation with you? I like people who have strong opinions, and I am that way, by the way. I have strong opinions that are very loosely held. Big difference, right? I have very strong opinions, but they're very loosely held to the extent that I'm willing to be convinced with logic and argument, that there's a different point of view, and I may embrace that, or I may not. So I don't want to go into any argument saying that something is evil by itself, right? So I think that's the frame we want to get into. So whenever brands are positioning themselves to be anti something, I'm like, but you already lost half the audience by having that positioning. So we have to figure out a way, and this doesn't mean that we say we are objective, by the way, right? Because end of the day, honestly, none of us are objective, right? The fact that a bunch of editors walk into a meeting and come out of it and say, these are the 7 stories on page 1. In India, it's 15 stories, unfortunately. These are the 7 stories on page 1 tomorrow. You are biased, right? You're choosing to tell your readers, these 7 are the most important things for you tomorrow morning on our front page. And so we shouldn't pretend like we are completely objective, but we should always aim for somewhat of the middle ground for very selfish reasons. We just want more people to read our stuff.
Jyotisha, you had a question. Go ahead.
Good evening, Raju. My question is something which has got closely to do with your experience in the industry. So you have spearheaded digital transformation and print digital integration across a lot of major media houses. So when you go digital, I believe that nature and content of the news kind of changes. So what in your experience has been that, I mean, have you experienced any kind of change in the way news content and nature has evolved through the years of digitizing news? So if you did observe a change, were you hopeful of it? Like, did it give you hope, or do you have reasons to be worried about it?
So I've observed change. That doesn't mean we have embraced that, right? So let me put it that way. We still fight it in some cases. The biggest change is that in the newspaper world, we were Moses coming down with the tablets every morning, right? And telling you what the 10 commandments were, translating that into whatever stories we chose, right? We talked down to our readers. We just told them, we will tell you what matters to you. And here they are. That was our print newspaper. So we embraced the idea of gatekeepers, that we were the gatekeepers, that we would somehow look at the world for you and tell you, this is the world, right? That worked, right? That worked when audiences didn't have the ability to look at the world themselves. What fundamentally changed with the internet was our audiences started developing independent ability beyond us gatekeepers to look at the world. Instead of embracing that, we have fought it very, very hard, and a root cause of all of our problems is that fight. I actually have long thought that the best role I can play as an editor is to go from being a gatekeeper to a gate opener. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, the reason somebody came to the Wall Street Journal in the internet age was not because the Wall Street Journal was the only way they can get business news. They came to me because they trusted me to look at all the business news out there and curate it for them. And first of all, select a bunch of things. And within that selection, say, this is the most important thing. So top of page 1, let's say, or 6-column headline versus 2-column headline or 1-column headline. So they were looking to me. First of all, they trusted me. They liked my quality. But they're looking for me to guide them through this amazing overflow of information that they were dealing with if they had to do it on their own. So what was the real selling point was the trust they had in me. So the more we could curate and leverage that trust, the more I could say, hey, here are 5 things that the Wall Street Journal did today. But if you're interested in small business, here are 3 other small business things that we did not do, but other people did. But because you trust me, let me curate it for you, right? But we fought that because we were very worried that if I tell them that the New York Times did some good small business story today, they'll go after the New York Times and never come back to me. What we forgot to understand was the value that we were providing was helping them navigate this excess of information. And they would always come back to me because I was making their life easier by curating it. So we didn't embrace this idea of like going from gatekeepers to gate openers to being really good curators, which you are seeing now, right? The most successful digital models are people who hyperlink to reports in their article, people who point to other things. because you don't worry that somebody who clicks off will go off and will never come back. In fact, they will remember that the New York Times helped me find some interesting things. Let me start with the New York Times every day, right? So that model, I think, is the most successful recipe and the biggest change from how journalism needs to be done, was done, to how it needs to be done and should be done. Some people have embraced that very openly, have, I think, done relatively better. Some people still fight it. I absolutely hate the idea that no Indian newspaper will credit some other newspaper, let alone point to them, which I think is a fundamental disservice to readers. It's a very selfish way of thinking about the world, because the reader will find out anyway that if you're Mint, that the Economic Times wrote something, or if you're the Economic Times, that Mint wrote something. To act like it didn't happen is like a fundamental disservice to your reader. So you're not putting your reader first. So I think that's the biggest change that has happened, in addition to the usual things, right? The ability to interact, the ability to multimedia, the ability to have a two-way, not only receive news, but also react to it. That's all technology driven. But that combined with this philosophical need, the shift still need to make, I think are the two biggest changes I've seen in journalism.
Thank you. Ruchika, you had a question. Go ahead and ask it, please. Ruchika, are you there?
Sir,
Okay, I can't hear you. Let's. Meda, please go ahead and ask it.
I think Nikita has typed her question. What is that? Can somebody read it?
Okay, Ruchika has asked a question. She's saying that, yeah, we know you and the team are coming up with a
sir,
lot.
am I?
No,
Hello?
yeah, now we can hear you. Go ahead and ask the question.
Good evening, sir. My question is that we know you are coming up with a long list of books under the McKinsey's 2020 reading list. So can you also suggest some journalism-specific books that have impressed you?
Sure. I must say that I'm not a fan of journalism books simply because it's changing so much that by the time somebody writes a contemporary book, its value a year later, because books take a while to come out. People have long asked me, like, why don't you write about a book about Indian journalism or media or this and that? And I'm like, by the time you write a book, so I'm contributing a chapter to a book that Columbia started writing last year about press freedoms around the world. I'm contributing the India chapter. I wrote it last August. It will come out sometime, maybe October this year. So everything in that has changed, right? But I'm stuck with that because that's when I submitted it. That's what happens with books, right? So I will never recommend that, because I'll only recommend it as saying, oh, that was that a year ago, that's what was happening, and now you should read this book, is how I view it. There are some interesting biographies, there are interesting profiles, especially for women journalists. I would strongly, strongly recommend reading Katharine Graham's autobiography. She's the founder of the founding family of the Washington Post. It's just one of the most amazing, even now, it's totally worth reading. It's a big book, by the way, 600 pages, but it just tells you, so it's historical, right? It doesn't have a lot of value, but it tells you something very, very interesting about journalism, the evolution of it. How do you play politics and journalism? How do you run newsrooms? How do you keep your independence, particularly for a woman publisher? So I think there are lots of books of that nature. My suggestion would be not to get too hung up on books, but to pay a lot of attention to journalism newsletters, journalism like Neiman Lab, Pointer. There are lots of, like, every day I read probably about 10 to 12 newsletters about journalism, because that curate a lot of things. So I think that's where you have a lot more value than reading books on journalism.
So can you suggest those which you read?
I'll ask him. I'll get that list from you later. And
yeah, I'll email you later today.
Yeah, thank you. Meda, you had a question. Go
sir.
ahead. Yeah, Meda, are you there?
So yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
So we've only been in this course for a week, and we've already spoken about objectivity many times. And what I am wondering is, we're going to be students who are sort of trained in objectivity, or as objective as we can be, but we're going to be entering an industry that isn't necessarily objective. We're going to be joining organizations that are owned by people who probably have vested political interests. So there seems to be this constant sort of friction between trying to be objective at an individual level, but the larger system doesn't really allow it. So what do you do when you're in that position?
Yeah, it's not a new problem, by the way. It's been there in India, for example. It's been there for probably 10, 15 years now, or more, actually. Two, three things. One is that all of us have individual ethics and individual values, right? So I think it's important for us not to give those up, even if you're in a circumstance where that's challenging. If you find that you're having to give those up all the time, you'll be an unhappy person because you want to live that life. So then we have some bigger choices to make, right? Do I want to work for this organization? Do I want to be in this profession? So that's the challenge. Most of us, and I say this, most of us probably don't run into those issues on a daily basis, by the way, right? You may read about it, right? You may read your own publication and say, oh, that story is total bullshit, right? You know it, but you didn't write it. Nobody asked you to do it, right? So you may disagree with that, but chances are that 90% of what you do on a day in, day out basis actually doesn't get into a lot of these like big, what is the promoter telling me to do stuff, right? Rarely happens, by the way, because there are majority of the beats, that's not an issue. But you will also be joining an organization which has, particularly in India, which has a clear history and a point of view, and you're making a conscious choice, right? By joining that organization. Sometimes you may feel like, look, it's the most prestigious organization in that field. I have no choice, I'll hold my nose and do it. There, my other thing applies, right? Which is that majority of what you do may not run into that issue. So it's a very individual choice you have to make. And you have to fight it, by the way. You have to fight it. The challenge I had when I set up Mint was we had a first code of conduct for an Indian newsroom. We enforced it, by the way, not just have it on paper. We had multiple sources, the transparency. We had a lot of things that was very different from everything that was done in business press in India up until that point. But people forget that the majority of the Mint newsroom, and I'm talking 2006, 2007, was all actually Indian journalists. Sure, I came back from the US and there were a few other expats, but most of them were Indian journalists, right? With that group, we were able to still produce a pretty, even if I say so myself, a very honest paper. So it's possible, right? It's not the system that's the problem. It's how you manage what you do, I think, and what leadership you provide. But the biggest issue I would face is people would come in and compare themselves to another publication and say, but they do this, right? And they are bigger than us. More people read them, and more of my sources read them. And I would say, you cannot compare yourself to the lowest common denominator, right? I don't care, right? We aim for this. We may fail, but this is what we aim for, right? But that has to come internally as well. You have to tell yourself, like, you're seeing your colleague mail it in almost, right? Phone it in, a story. While you are like saying, I need to get 3 sources, I need to really do it well, right? And they get better play. And it's easy for you to say over time, you know what, I'm not going to put this effort. I'm just going to be, and people fall into that because over and over, if that happens, you tend to kind of settle. So I would urge all of you, look, you're going to be young for a long time, but you're still, you have certain aspirations. You want to change the system. You want to expose some things. You want to bring certain values. And I hope that's why you're in journalism, not to be on TV and make a lot of money. That's it. That's good too, by the way. More power to you if you can do that. So I hope that you will hold. And this relates to my issue of, like, you may have multiple jobs over a 10-year period. There may come a time when you may have to choose. You may have to say, I need to walk away from this place because it's just driving me crazy with what they do. And I'll find something where I hope to have less of these issues, right? That's some of you may choose to go there, right? Some of you may strongly believe that your only role is to be an adversarial journalist. Totally fine, right? And you may choose to go and work for a website or something that these days, unfortunately, I don't even know. For a few years ago, I would have said you may choose to go and work for Tehalka. Totally fine as well, right? You choose to practice that kind of journalism. And so I think it's a very individual choice, but the only advice I would have is that hold on to your values and beliefs and fight for it as much as you can, because once you give those up, very slippery slope.
Shreya, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hello, sir. I'm Shreya. I'm from the Business and Financial Journalism course. So I had a question that in Western media, journalists aren't allowed to harass their subjects for information. But in India, we've had journalists insult their guests on their shows and refuse to acknowledge that they have insulted them just because they have a different view. So when we get into this kind of an industry, we're also expected to stick to the policies of the media organization that we get into and go to the lens that these people go to. So where is the line and how do we hold ourselves accountable to these principles that we learn in class? Or how could we change this system?
Yeah, so can I first start by saying that people like Arnav and others who are illustrative examples perhaps of what you're trying to say, I don't consider them journalists in the news sense. I consider them as like in a traditional news sense, I consider them as opinion writers, columnists. They're not journalists in a news sense. So let's make that very clear distinction, right? So these people are not, talk shows don't add any original content. They just talk about other people's stuff. And somebody may choose to say that our approach to attracting TRPs or whatever they call them in India these days is by screaming at our guests, right? So that's the business model. And advertisers seem to be fine being there because a lot of people, the number of people who privately tell me this is horrible and then watch the entire show every day is amazing, right? So either you think it's horrible and you walk away from it, you don't give them your time and money, or you actually don't mean it and you like it. So in which case, you deserve it, right? So having said that, even within TV, look, a close friend of mine, 30 years now, went to journalism school together, is Uma Sudhir of NDTV South India, right? Uma is a tough journalist, asks hard questions, but is no way screaming at people, insulting them or anything. The best adversarial, difficult conversations you have with people on TV are actually very polite. You just, I mean, BBC has mastered this, right? There's entire shows that, Crossfire, is it? I forget the name now.
Hard Talk, right?
Hard Talk, sorry. Hard Talk. There was a recent interview that a guy named Jonathan Swan, S-W-A-N-N, of Axios, A-X-I-O-S, did with President Trump. It's available on the web, watch it. One of the toughest interviews the president has done, but is done in a completely non-adversarial way, right? So I think there are ways to do it. There are ways to get your audience to like you, what you're doing, to be seen as different, being in somebody's face without being mean and nasty, as some of these people are doing. So it's possible. But honestly, if you chose to work for a TV brand whose model is to insult their guests, and guests seem to be happy to be insulted, then you are signing up for that, right? You can't complain after that. Mm-hmm. So it's, the thing that bothers me about a lot of Indian journalists, I must say, much more so than in the West, they often respond to my tweets or things like that. These are journalists. I'm totally fine if they have a point of view. They also insult the author of that column. And I'm like, look, I've just lost you. I don't pay any attention to you. If you start by saying why something is wrong and then end by saying these are lip tarts, right? I'm like, done. I no longer care for you because you can't separate factual criticism to your personal views of that person who wrote it, right? So don't be that person. Be critical of people, right? The only way a nation, a profession, as individuals, we can get better if we are critical. But being critical is not the same thing as being negative, right? Which is, I think a lot of people confuse that often. So the thing that bothers me is when journalists on social media are critical, it's fine. That's part of our job. But then don't be negative, don't be nasty, because then you're like being you're being an asshole. So I think that's the distinction I would draw. Be hard, be tough, be in somebody's face, be push back on them, challenge their assumptions, but you don't have to be mean, you don't have to be ugly about it. It's a skill, by the way. That's a profound skill that you need to develop.
So we're running out of time, but we'll take a couple of more questions and then we'll close for the day. Jeelam had a question. Can you go ahead and ask? Are you there, Jeela?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So I'm Jayam Bhattacharya. So I have a question. Tell me something ever since the COVID arrived, and then like the freelance journalism, I'm considering the print. As we all know, like the print publication in Bombay has shut down. So what is your take about the print journalism? How it is getting hampered during this situation, and also at the same time, the freelance journalism who are working for the printer. So what is your take about it, and how it could be improved in the coming days and once comes into normalcy?
Yeah, so I think all of you and a lot of Indian media and the business model lived in this false myth that in India, print will continue to be fine because everybody made up their circulation numbers. Everybody thought, we'll continue to grow, no problem, India is different. Totally not true, hasn't been true for a long time. And I've been saying this publicly for a long time that it's not true. Now the water has receded and we are seeing who are all the naked people, right? Chances are that, like I said earlier, 20 to 40% of print advertising, print revenues, print readers, print circulation is never going to come back. I think these are people who are gone for good starting now. So those print organizations that will be successful are two kinds. One that will realize this and make changes. Unfortunately, some of the changes could mean a smaller newsroom, a smaller publication, fewer editions maybe, right? And jumpstart, which is unfortunate in India that nobody is still doing it, jumpstart the transition to digital. There is no alternative. Generations of Indians no longer read papers and will never read. So if you don't do it now, you're going to be dead if you're a news organization. The good news, I think, if I were running an Indian news organization now, I would actually triple down on my freelancers because the cost of getting content from them is relatively lower than my own staff, right? So I would actually do a lot more investment and spend money on freelancing and get a lot more content and perhaps reduce my newsroom because I can't afford to have permanent people. So I have a feeling that the pain has just begun. It'll stretch out over the next year, and then we'll get to a point where there's a little bit more stability. Look, I think Indian print, especially language print, will probably continue to do well because the demographics, the literacy rate, the spread of urbanization, all are in favor of that. But English language newspapers in cities, they're in deep, deep trouble, I think. And they know that. And the repercussions will be fewer jobs, perhaps, and smaller newsrooms.
Ajay, you had a question.
Hi, Raju. You hear me? Yeah. My question is regarding media histrionics because the reason, today news is being sold with a lot of histrionics and melodrama and etc. So especially if you look at the American news broadcast like Fox News, if you look, they do use a lot of melodramas and like they shoot their news in such a way that they spice it up and sell it. And as a news consumer, sometimes I tend to overreact and it doesn't allow me to think. So moving forward in the post-COVID world, will media histrionics have a role to play, and will it have an influence on business and financial journalism? That is my question.
Listen, I think we should separate television from print, from magazines, from web, right? Because I think the amount of histrionics you can do on each of these platforms varies significantly. Doesn't mean that there is no histrionics on the web, right? If you look at a Breitbart or if you look at a Drudge report, you look at some of these things, that you could do a lot with 70-point headline. So you could do some histrionics, but they're limited by the media. I think that, again, I go back to this point of we need to start making a fundamental distinction between television opinions and talk shows and news. I think that's, in India, people tend to particularly confuse that, right? And in the US, I think a lot of people don't think of Fox News as a standard objective newsroom anymore anyway. Just like some people think that MSNBC on the left is extreme left, right? But there's a big difference, by the way, between those two in terms of news versus objectivity and all of that. So, look, the reason why it succeeds
is because despite all of you complaining, most of you watch it. The number of people who would tell me when I was running Mint that other paper has made up stuff, they would sell stories, they would like publish bias stories, or they would be in the pocket of somebody, and senior business execs who would complain to me, right? And then read it every day. And I'm like, hey, the only way you can send a signal to them is if you stop subscribing to it, stop reading it, right? But you can't have it both ways. As a society and as a country, you can't be watching somebody for entertainment, maybe that's what you're watching, and then complain about that person being not objective news, right? So this is where I'm actually pretty, my view is like, look, I may have a point of view, I may never watch it, but every country, every society deserves the media and the government it elects, right? So I'm like, every 5 years there are elections, and if you guys want a particular government and you elect it with a relatively clean election, that's what the majority of the country is asking for. So we could always find flaws in, right? Who are we to say that that's not the right government? Similarly, if a bunch of new television stations in the last 5 years have shot up to the top with a form of histrionics, as you call it, but they seem to attract an audience, fundamentally, there's nothing wrong in it, right? Because there are still choices. India has more news choices than most of the countries in the world, by the way, right? So you can choose something that's less histrionic. You can choose something that's not at all histrionic. But business models and journalists of a set will give what people seem to want.
Nitin, you'll ask the last question, and then we'll go for the closing comments. Nitin, go ahead and ask your
Hi, sir. Good evening. My name is Nitin Narayan. I'm a student of the Bloomberg Business and Financial Journalism course. Sir, I want your views that why aren't whistleblowers protected in a country like India vis-a-vis the US? A, and sir, B, that how accepting are publications in New York and US to PR pitches vis-a-vis India? I have been in PR for the last few years, so that's why the PR question. And I would also like to know your views on the whistleblower part.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to answer because that there are both like there are laws of the land that protect somebody or not protect. So in India, the laws of the land make it very hard if you're a government employee, or if you're a company employee, or if you're any of the, if you give some information that is technically considered private, right? So you may not have the legal protections that allow you to do that. You can only appeal to a higher kind of persuasion, saying I'm exposing corruption, though technically you may have stolen some document, right, under the laws of the land. And so the legal system will pursue the laws of the land. The legal system may agree with you that you did the right thing, but if you did the illegal thing, you will still have to be prosecuted, right? So it's a matter of like them putting pressure to change the laws of the land to make it friendlier. I think one of the biggest challenges with the Indian legal system is the laws are relatively against such leakers or such people. B, the legal system is so slow that even if before you get to a decision, you could be completely financially and otherwise exhausted. So it's often misused to get you to kind of drop it or not take it on. So there are all those issues that can only be addressed through parliament or changing the laws or the courts acting on something, right? So it's hard to say that they should be the same as in the US, because again, the US, for example, in the US, the libel law is such that the onus of you proving that somebody libeled you if they are media is on you, not on the media. That's the fundamental protection we have. In India, on the other hand, the criminal libel and all these other things immediately first throw you in jail, right? So I think there are the fundamental challenges. You need to fight for the laws to be changed. On your second question, listen, there is significant appetite for India, but you run into a few things. First of all major news organizations have an Indian presence, whether small or big, usually small, but they have a presence. One, so they would want to give them the opportunity to write about something first. Two, because of our English language and our long tradition of good journalism among individuals, there are a lot of Indians who actually pitch stories and get published. So they have a track record. So people might go to them. Three, you must recognize that if I'm sitting in New York, and even though I'm Indian and I'm reading the New York Times, I don't really want to read about India every day in the New York Times. Right? I want to read the occasional big smart story that is relevant to me sitting in New York. So the New York Times editors have 200 such countries to deal with, right? So if they publish something on Chennai, which was very fascinating and interesting, let's say that you've pitched, lucky if you get it in, it's in, great, more power to you. But that doesn't mean that they will take anything from you about Chennai for the next year, because how many stories will the New York Times want to run about Chennai, right? So that's the challenge you have. How do you, first of all, find interesting stories that nobody else has discovered, connect it to what that particular brand's audience is and their interests are, and then if you get it in, the next time they want a story from you, maybe a year from now. So it's very hard to make a living for all those reasons that I've cited. So, but the appetite is there. You are still seeing a lot of like interesting, I read some of the best stories about India from outside of Indian publication organizations, right? Oftentimes these days they are written by Indians. Used to be in the past, they're only written by Westerners. They still happen, by the way, once in a while, it's only by a Westerner. But there's more of it, there are more venues, there are more opportunities, but these are the practicalities that you have to think about.
Thank you so much. We have completely run out of time.
Thank you.
Venki will now give the closing comments and then we'll say call it a day.
Thank you so much, Raju, for that fascinating and magisterial tour of the media landscape. It was richer also because you straddle many worlds. I mean, you've worked in, in 3 different geographies, if I'm not wrong, America, India, and in Europe as well. And you not only that, you worked on the news side of things, on the opinion side of things, as well as the business side of things. So you brought great perspective from both ends. One of the things I'm always fond of telling my students, which sentiment you echoed today, is as bad as we may, it's easy for us to pick on Arnold's style of journalism, but as bad as it is, we have to celebrate the fact that we have these information choices. And simply because I started my career in 1985, and in 1984 I was doing my diploma in journalism, and that was the year Indira Gandhi was assassinated. And I remember distinctly that her son Rajiv Gandhi, who subsequently became the prime minister, he recalled in an interview 6 months later that on the day that Indira Gandhi was shot, he, as the prime minister's son, had to tune into BBC to get news of his mother's assassination.
We can't hear you, Venki, please. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, again it's gone.
So, on.
It's there.
Oh, can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah.
My apologies. So this is what I like to tell them. As bad as it is, it's always better to have an excess of information options than to have too few. And I was particularly enthralled by the fact that you spoke out so vehemently against preaching to the choir, because that a lot of that happens. There's a lot of virtue signaling that happens in the media space. And the point that you made about reaching beyond your traditional audiences to newer audiences, I think that holds particularly true in an environment where media entities are severely challenged. For students of this, who listened in today, I think they'll take away a very, very important message, which is that media entities may come and go. The media organizations they work for may collapse today or tomorrow, or they may erode. But the joy of journalism will continue forever. I think that's a very inspirational message that you gave us, and for the students, and that's an important takeaway. If anything, I have only one regret from all this, Raju, which is that you refused to go on record. I would have liked to have gotten you on record, because some of these views need broader amplification. And the fact that you were able to speak candidly about many of those problems that afflict the media industry, I think it was refreshing to hear. We don't often hear it from from an insight.
Yeah, and like I said, I think first of all, thank you for having me. I'm always been a fan of ACJ. I've visited a few times. I've hired people from there when I was at Mint. I recommend the school. My usual statement about ACJ is that there are about 400 journalism degree granting institutes or universities in India. 399 of them, the degree is not worth the paper on which it's granted. ACJ has always been an exception, so I'm a huge fan, and so I'm happy to be doing this. I think you're lucky to be there, and you know from your own past placement that all of you are usually end up in good jobs. So I'm delighted. Thank you for having me. Listen, I think we should be optimistic about our future as storytellers, because the demand for that will be infinite. So I think if you think of yourself as that, and the reason I am on the record, the only reason is that my current job makes it a little bit more complicated simply because just potential conflict of interest with the firm, and I don't want to put them in a position for nothing that they have to do with my past. So it's just that reason. I'm also, by the way, I'm generally very available for anybody who has the occasional individual question. I'm reachable. I'm on Twitter at Raju. My email is easy to find. It's my full name at gmail.com. Short of asking me for journalism jobs, which I can no longer give because I no longer work in journalism. If anybody has any question in the future, please feel free to reach out. I am pretty responsive. You may not get an answer back like right away, but you'll definitely get an answer back because I do feel responsible. Whether I like it or not, I have been a role model, especially for Indian journalists, because of what I've done, and I think that puts the onus on me to respond. So I'm happy to respond in the future as well. But thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Raju. And
okay, take care. Bye.
Take care. You too. Bye bye.
Thank
Thank you, sir.
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 Thank you, sir.